Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to February Fantasy Stories, an event that I'm allegedly hosting. I took over the hosting duties from the Bookish Bryants, who had a little bit too much on their plate IRL, uh, and I've been largely dropping the ball in February. I've been reading a lot of fantasy, far more than usual. I slotted a lot more fantasy into my reading than I usually do. I did that much for February Fantasy Stories, but despite what I would most like, the rest of you aren't here watching me read. I would love it if we had just if I had a regular roster of guest stars over here for wine and calzones and late night talks about books and whatnot. But instead, the reading that I'm doing is not being filmed, so it's not helping February Fantasy Stories. Uh, and the reading that I'm doing, I'm going to show you. I picked two things that I've read just recently, that reread in both cases just recently, for February Fantasy Stories. But even that reading isn't helping because the original idea of February Fantasy Stories was to concentrate on shorter books. 200 pages, maybe concentrate exclusively on short stories. And I certainly haven't done that. it's harder than I thought to host February Fantasy Stories. No wonder the Bookish Bryants look so old and withered. But I thought I'd go over a couple of things that I've been reading as a kind of February Fantasy Stories update for the week that we have left in the month. And one of them is kind of a BookTube made me do it. It's a reread. As one of, when you have a big sprawling reading life and also a fairly demanding real world life, I've noticed that a lot of people don't approach that the way I do. I mean, if you watch this channel, you already know I don't have that kind of a life, and so I approach my reading in a very bit drill, small bore way. I might have ongoing projects, but I'm not picking and pecking at them. I'm doing things one by one. Most readers don't do that. Most really good readers keep their reading really multiform and lots of things on the go. And Mark Richardson at Richardson Reads, one of the things that he's doing is inspired, I think, by our watching of the TV show adaptation of The Wheel of Time, is to reread these books, is to reread Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. And I'd been meaning to do that forever and ever, and I reread the first book, Eye of the World, specifically because of the TV show version of The Rings of Power, or the Wheel of Time. That was a Freudian slip, wasn't it? We'll get there. Eventually, we'll get there. Eventually, I'll do a 5-hour video on The Rings of Power. But I bought a reissued hardcover of Eye of the World and reread it. I enjoyed it a lot more than I ever had before. I don't think that had anything to do with the TV show. I just think I've, inadvertently, reluctantly grown as a reader in the time since I read it the last time. So I've kind of sort of been on the same wavelength as Mark in that I would like to reread all of these books in a fairly timely manner. So I reread book 2, The Great Hunt. And a lot of the things that I really liked about my reread of Eye of the World, I also really liked about my reread of this. It is sharper than I thought. These early books are sharper than I remembered. They don't have a whole lot in the way of dramatic beats. And that led me just reflexively to remember them as being dull. That's not actually true in these early books. I'm fairly certain the closer we get to the end of the series, the closer we get to the present day and the sharper my memories are, I'm pretty sure that my judgment about these books growing to be mind-numbingly dull, moss on rock dull, is accurate. But who knows? Who knows? I had a significant, maybe a 25-26% revision of my estimation of Eye of the World. My revision of this book was smaller than that. This is a lot longer than it needs to be. This is very much a sequel. It doesn't stand on its own as a book in any way, which I hold against it. I, of course, hold against it. I hold that against any. I know that fantasy and science fiction, fantasy especially, is most vulnerable to that yardstick, but nevertheless, I'm applying that yardstick. If your books don't stand on their own, they're a weakness. If you want a highlight, a demonstration of how that can be true, you need look no further than another read-along that Mark Richardson is gradually at his own pace doing, which is a read-along of the Hornblower novels. C.S. Forster's Horatio Hornblower novels do stand on their own. Every one of them does. It can be done. It, in fact, should be done. And this doesn't at all. This will make almost no sense to you if you haven't read the first book with care. And even if you've read the first book with care, this largely withholds its dramatic payoffs. They're going to come in the next book, maybe the book after that, maybe not for 10 books. Jordan, when he was writing these books, he was saying, I have no end in sight. I'm going to keep writing these books until they nail my coffin closed, which actually happened. But some of the revisions that I experienced in Eye of the World, I experienced in this book. I guess what I'm trying to say is I enjoyed this more with this reread. And maybe 16 or 17% more. So maybe those percentages stay true if I reread the whole series. I did a review of the final book in the series, the one written by Brandon Sanderson, Memory of Light. And in that review, I said that the first book had a few good points surrounded by a great deal of sludge, and that the second book had a few fewer good points surrounded by a great deal more sludge, and that process just kept going until finally books 8 through 12 or whatever are pure sludge. There isn't anything going on in them at all. And I wrote in my review that made Brandon Sanderson's final volume in this series all the more of an astonishing revelation, because it's so good. It's just such an amazing volume of fantasy. Again, completely incomprehensible if you don't know the series. But if you do know the series, the plain and simple truth, the awkward truth here is that Robert Jordan could not have ended his series as well as Brandon Sanderson did. No one wants to admit that. I'm sure that Sanderson's too nice a guy and too loyal a reader to ever say that. But I don't owe any loyalty to Robert Jordan or anything else, and I can certainly say it. There's no way. First of all, Jordan said by his own admission that he was never going to write that conclusion. But even if he had, even his publisher had a long come to Jesus moment with him and said, "Look, you gotta wrap this up and move on to pastures new." Even if he tried to do it, Robert Jordan's version of A Memory of Light would not have been as good as Brandon Sanderson's. Naturally, I'm thinking those thoughts when I'm looking at something like this. I shouldn't. It's not fair to Robert Jordan in two ways, one negative and one positive. To look at a book like The Great Hunt with this beautiful cover as raw material. That's not fair to him in a bad way, because it's a slap in the face insult to him as an author, and it's also not fair to him in a good way because it lets him off the hook. If this is raw, if all he's producing is raw material, then what am I supposed to say? No food critic is going to criticize the ingredients of the meal. They're going to criticize the end product. So this was a reread, and it felt like a slog, but not as much of a slog. So I am still on board with the ruthless high school style Mean Girls peer pressure that Mark Richardson is exerting. I will move on to the next book, Dragon Reborn. I will move on to that and just keep going with this read along. I'd like, ideally, if book buying serendipity would be in my favor for this, and that the mass market paperbacks of all of these books would regularly crop up for me. I have them all in ebook form, but I read Eye of the World. I reread Eye of the World in that reissued hardcover, which may or may not be actually visible behind me now that I'm thinking about it. It may be visible, but I reread Eye of the World that way, and I reread this in mass market, and I have Dragon Reborn in mass market. I'm kind of hoping that maybe the next book of the series, book 4, is The Shadow Rising. I'm kind of hoping that I find that in a mass market paperback. And if you are at a thrift shop and you find a mass market paperback of that that's in fairly good condition, I want you to buy it with your own money, pop it in an envelope, and mail it to me. Because that is the nature of this parasocial relationship. You're all my pawns. Seriously though, if you see it, if, for instance, you go to your Goodwill or whatever, and someone has unloaded all of these mass markets, the good condition part was a joke. It doesn't need to be in good condition. Feel free to contact me and let me know. I would love to read these all in paperback instead of switching to ebooks. But I'm going to move on. That was a big thing that I did for February Fantasy Stories. I read a gigantic epic. I also read a shorter book. And this also was a reread. This is Patricia McKillop. This is the Riddle-Master of Head. Same cover artist, and also a beautiful cover. And this also, it's a much shorter book, but this also was a bit of a disappointment. This is the story of a world in which wizards and higher magic and all of the protracted exposition dumps that we associate with wizards about the world and the real nature of reality, those are all gone. They exist only in a gigantic and extended folklore literature body of riddles and gnomic utterances, but the people themselves are gone. And we encounter a prince who's he's a very prosaic guy. This is a very, very prosaic world. One of the charming underlying assumptions of this book is that without knowledge, the world becomes bland, which I can't help but like. But nevertheless, we have a hero. We have a standard hero, a prince who is an ordinary guy. He is surrounded by ordinary guys. He goes on an extraordinary quest. And we know from the exposition that we get in the book what that quest is going to be. We know that the reclamation of that lost knowledge, not in the form of riddles or songs, but in reality, and also by easy extension, the reclamation of the people who had that authority, the wizards themselves. We know the larger scale of what the quest plot is going to be in this book. And so we just want to get on with it. And that is it's a fairly standard fantasy plot that is just sort of unfolded in fairly standard ways, and that bothered me a lot more. When I first read this came out in the early 80s, I think, 1976. When I first read this, I was hungry for any epic fantasy, and I gobbled it up, and I gobbled up all the books all the sequels that followed it. But this time around, not quite so. This was a bit of a disappointment. One of the ways that I alleviated my disappointment at how predictable this is. This is also a bit of mistiming. We don't know enough because McKillop has removed the standard vehicle by which fantasy exposition is delivered. Because that vehicle is gone, we don't learn enough, just expositionally speaking, about this world to get us really interested by the time the action of this novel stops. We know that will be revealed, but that's, like I mentioned, that's no consolation. The book itself, it doesn't match those two. We don't know enough by the end of the book to really care enough. Unless you care about the characters, and the characters are thinly drawn. And one of the reasons that I didn't care about that when I first read this, because I was hungry for epic fantasy. One of the reasons that I sort of alleviated it a little in this reread is with a weird kind of hindsight bifocalism. Because when I was reading this, I realized what it is and what it always was, which is YA. That is what accounts for the thinness of the characterization. That is what accounts for the one-note nature of the dialogue or the very primary color nature of the action, is that this is YA. And the reason that there was sort of split vision bifocalism is because when I first read this, no one knew the term YA. There were kids' books and maybe books for young people, but no one certainly ever categorized books as YA. This wasn't marketed that way. This was marketed in the fantasy section of bookstores. The fantasy rack of the spinner rack at the drugstore or whatnot. This wasn't put in the children's section that I recall at all. And even if you knew the characterizations of that kind of writing, then the term didn't apply. And in the subsequent 50 years, not only has the term arrived, but the term has started to dictate the content. Now people know when they are about to write YA, they know what they're doing. They write to that register. That's why so much YA is so boring, because it's so programmatic. And this is that register. It just doesn't, I'm sure it wasn't written that way. I'm sure it wasn't intended that way, actually, but it read that way to me this time around. I have to confess, I found the third book in this series, and then at a stroke of luck, I found the second book as well, all with these in these mass markets with these original covers. And I have to confess, rereading The Riddle-Master of Head really took the steam out of me wanting to reread any of the rest of the books. I have them, so I certainly will. I don't think I'll do it for February Fantasy Stories, but So I had two rereads. One was a marginally greater appreciation, and one a marginally less appreciation. The one thing that's missing is one of the hallmarks of February fantasy stories, which I need to correct. I will correct that in the rest of the month, which is shorter works. Riddle-Master of Head, I think, is 200 and something pages long. 224 pages long. That's with maps and an index and whatnot, so 200 pages thereabouts, which technically fits for February fantasy stories. But what I want to do for the rest of the month is concentrate on actual short stories. And I just recently discovered, very, very recently discovered, that the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, Squarebound Magazine of Fantasy of Science Fiction, which half the content is science fiction short stories, the other half is fantasy short stories. I just recently realized that is part of my Kindle Unlimited subscription. I could have been reading that this whole time for free, or for the pennies that it costs per day if you do Kindle Unlimited. So I'll start there, and then I think there's a previous issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction that I bought without knowing that I had it in Kindle Unlimited that I haven't read. I think I started reading one of the stories in that volume. It was about terraforming an alien planet. Scientists discover eel-like creatures, which naturally makes them wonder about terraforming and the ethics of terraforming the planet. And then they start to wonder if the eel-like creatures are intelligent and maybe even have some kind of culture. And there's that world. I was reading that story, and I was thinking, oh, that's world building, but I kept getting hit over the head. It wasn't a background detail at all. I kept getting hit over the head by the author over and over and over again that one of the 22nd century humans who are involved in the crew thinking about terraforming this planet thinks that she is neither male nor female, which is more outlandish world building than the semi-sentient eel-like creatures who have a culture made out of sound. So I was reading the book, and I kept getting hit over the head with that the story might as well have been assuming that I already know there are, in real life, eel-like creatures who are building a culture out of sound. The story might as well have been assuming that. It was assuming what our culture is assuming, this completely outlandish science fiction storyline that has no basis in reality whatsoever. It certainly has no basis in biology. And that was just an assumption on the story. And if it had been a background assumption, I guess I could have paid attention. Well, the writing was kind of pro forma too, but I would have at least been able to pay more attention to the story, except that kept hitting me over the head. The author put it foremost in the story. One kind of unexamined world building next to a kind of examined world building. And it was, in other words, that story, the first story that I read in that older issue of fantasy and science fiction, was just shrill Twitter politicking. And that it took me immediately out of the story and kept me out of the story. The story's purpose was not to tell me a story or to get me thinking about the ramifications of world building or whatever, or the ethics of terraforming. The story had a different point. And it was, here's what our shared real world reality is like. Didn't you notice? And on my own time, when I'm not going to be reviewing the thing, I'm not going to have to think about it at all in terms of an audience. When I'm just reading it for pleasure, I'm not going to do that. I'm just not going to do it. So I stopped, and I didn't go back to the rest of that issue, which is jam-packed. The Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction is jam-packed. You've got a lot of material there. And I didn't look at any of it. I just dropped the whole thing. So I should go back to that. I'll read the digital issue that I have, and also I have a few fantasy anthologies. And the ones that were written before 2007 don't have any Twitter politicking in them. They don't have any of that at all. So I could avoid, if I'm reading purely for my own pleasure, I could avoid that problem entirely by just going to older stories. just eliminate it completely. So maybe I'll do that. It feels like a little bit of cowardice. Also feels like shooting myself in the foot. I might be missing really great new talents. It's entirely possible that even a writer who is doing that kind of idiot posturing is a legitimate major new talent. That's also entirely possible. Reading is complicated. The world's not fair. so my point being that I will buck up. I will put on my big boy boots, and I will do some fantasy short story reading for the rest of February fantasy stories. After which I will take the walk of shame off stage because I have not been hosting this event the way I should be. And I will write a groveling apology to the Bookish Bryants and hand off the baton to them next year when I can just co-host. Kind of weird that I did 5 times as many videos when I was co-hosting February Fantasy Stories last year as I did when I'm hosting it this year. We're going to let it go. So that is my update for February Fantasy Stories. It is 2 books. I'm going to do a great deal more fantasy reading in February, but short stuff. So I will do a report at the end of the month, and I will see you then. Thank you.